This is the nameless protagonist. We've got just a few people in the chat here. So let me know if you guys can hear me okay. If the volume is clear or anything's foggy or odd sounding, just let me know. Otherwise, just hit a 1 if you guys can hear me. Excellent. Okay. We got a couple people here. Excellent. Excellent. Do a quick couple shout outs before we go ahead and get started. Let's see. We got Sick Diggios. What's going on, fam? Adrian Hicks. He says, let's go, Os. Truth Inspired Broadcast. Os. And I'm doing this on my phone, so I'm still getting used to that. Excuse the speed here. Onk. It's got the Tory Gate on there. The Dragon's Gate, technically. That'll definitely be a conversation soon. Os. Ibo Sosa. Os, good to see you, fam. You fuck with the background thumbnail. Yeah, man. Back to the dojo. We got a couple jewels we're gonna break down and get into today. We got the Quiet Storm. Os, glad to see you can make it again, fam. I gotta hold an open panel again pretty soon. I will be doing an open dojo very, very soon. So keep an eye out on that. It says, are you using a Bluetooth headset with your, technically, yes. It's supposed to be higher quality. So let me know if that quality is showing up or if it's not. It's hard for me to tell from my angle. It may be that the app isn't picking up the proper auxiliary because the earphones I have to use also have a mic on it. So there's multiple mics it can pick up from. And nah, this is Samurai Showdown. Figured I'd keep it appropriate. Got BGS. He said, chicken in with that ninja over there. Also, BGS. I got new tech. It's time. Check your email pretty soon. I'm going to be sending you some stuff. It's time. You're going to want in on this conversation. We got Mr. Blue Collar. What's up, Os? But yeah, man, let's go ahead. We'll get the dojo open and get started. So firstly, to the founders of the space, Os. For those of you in the chat and listening in on the playback, Os. This is the nameless protagonist. Today, as you know, I'll be having special guests with me. Maggie Thompson under the veil. She'll be joining us shortly, and we will be continuing the third segment of our Transcendence of the Avatar. And we've been getting into a lot of the foundational understandings of not just transcendental psychology, but the effects of commodification and commercialization in the modern world, what it's done for people and their values, and steps people can take to not only reassess their orientation as it relates to all of these things, but to potentially recognize that behavior in others and find ways to either engage or not engage in ways that are in alignment with your own personal values and how you want to address that. I think awareness is an excellent first step to getting into a lot of those spots and places. And given that we're dealing with a lot of the first and second order effects of these things in a broad blanket sense in the space, these things are good to have in the back of your mind. So you can, with healthy borders, at least socially, with regard to what you will and will not do, forge a better understanding of when and how you want to engage in these things, and curate a better understanding of how you want to approach relationships with yourself and other people, whether they be mundane, plutonic, or otherwise. But without further ado, let me add our special guest on.
Hello.
All right, you there?
I am.
Excellent. Excellent. Yeah, you heard the intro. It's round 3.
I don't know if we want to pick up on the conversation we were just having about the death principles, life principles, libido, and, the fear-based neurotic beliefs that guide our behavior.
Yeah, I think it'll be a good point that people can go back and research later, because this kind of sounds like 101 first principles, getting into the orthodox, so to speak, of a lot of these things that I guess I can call it the canon psychology for psychotherapy, at least the building blocks for CBT.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And because I think that Jungian psychological terms, they're kind of like an accent or points that can be articulated from a certain point of view. I don't think that that's necessarily the primary grammar that a lot of these things are spoken through. And so if you can at least get an understanding of what the canon is saying now, you can see why there was an obsession with trying to pathologize any sort of behavior that seemed like it was off expectation, especially when at the time, which was a point you were making, when the definition of being off key was so rooted in, we're going to say, a pre-industrial perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And not necessarily in a way that matched what was going on with the culture at the time. In other words, what the people actually needed. It was more of an attempt to create these templates, these cookie cutters, like we said in one of the earlier statements, for people to fit in, not looking at where people are, but trying to get people to where they want them to be.
Yeah, I mean, as far as Freud is concerned, who was the first one who said that we have an inner world, we have a mind? Up until then, nobody had ever considered it. And it's odd to think about now that we had ever considered it, but everything that we did was externally motivated, and we didn't necessarily, and we've all had this time in our lives where we're not necessarily thinking about what we think or thinking about what we feel. And we didn't know to do that. And then here comes Freud, who is a physician. He's a doctor, and he sees women. And, he's hearing a lot of things from these women that are just so neurotic because of the time. So all of his theories are based on these neuroses that these Gilded Age women were having, where their focus is society and modesty, extreme modesty. So this was a time when you couldn't show your ankles because men would become ravenous and rape you. And those are the prevailing thoughts. And so there's a lot of neuroses going on, but he is the father of modern psychoanalytics, because he said there's an inner mind, and there's inner thoughts, and there's a subconscious, and there's an unconscious, which really freaked people out. And the life principle and the death principle and the libido were things that, we still utilize to today. Jung was right on his heels with the inner mind and the subconscious, and he went way deeper in there.
Yeah. And I really want to highlight this point about the importance of introducing the concept of the subconscious mind, because I think that when we look at how, what is the term? I want to say psychology went through a sort of mainstream pseudoscience era. So there's what was going on behind closed doors with a very small circle of people. Then there's the international conversation, a lot of people from Germany involved in that. And then there comes this trickle down sort of, I'm going to call it cosmopolitan style psychology that really introduced some of these things, where for a long time, any and everything, and this is where we get this tendency to pathologize things. You know, every aspect of human behavior had to have some sort of line of effect back to some unrealized fear or some spectrum of sexual repression or negativity. And psychology gave people a name for it. And then at the same time, the subconscious became this kind of a scapegoat for almost any and everything. But there was never any tools to assist in exploring it. When it's interesting, when I look at it, I get into readings that I'm hearing from people back in the 1600s, and they're talking about these concepts that sound exactly like what is being described now as the subconscious mind.
Well, what happens with a lot of science, and it's unfortunate that it happens with a lot of science, and you can probably, if you think about different scientific genres, you'll figure it out. But what happens is it's the religious overlay is put on it. And so then it becomes, you know, when we look at your id, ego, super ego, right? Then the id is the devil, right? The one who's whispering in your ear to eat the donut, to push the down, to, you know, your subconscious is dirty and bad and has terrible thoughts and is pushing you and driving you to do these things. It's the devil. You know, you have the super ego that's God, and we listen to God. And so, I mean, even quantum physics went through a period where it was, I don't even know if it's a word, but it was religiousized. You know?
Oh, well, what they wanted to use it for was to validate the idea of there being a universal observer, which is keeping the universe in check, which is why everything doesn't dissipate into a massive wave function.
Right, the watcher. So you have the primary watcher, you know,
right.
Is the curse on the back of a turtle, is it, you know, all the different concepts, but it even, you know, it's that you have the you, and then you have the good actor, and then you have the bad actor. So that's where it's religiousized, that no matter what it is in science, people are expected to place themselves in that equation. And then there's a good actor who does good for you. And then there's a bad actor that does bad against you, no matter what science it is. There's always the bad thing you have to fight against, and always the good thing you're trying to get. And it always somehow leads back to morality. And if you have the proper morality, or you do things right, you know, you work hard your whole life, you do this, you do, and rightness is always dictated by society and never by the person.
It's interesting because and maybe you'll notice this as well, there's a vicarious relationship to the principle you're describing and justice. And it's interesting because there is a self-sacrifice element that's inherent in the implication of being a moral, upright individual as described. And what seems to always shift at the time may be the definition of these things, but the religion seems to be the primordial egg that these concepts hatch from, irrespective. I've always said that if you want to have an understanding of a culture, go take a look at the religious undertones that animate it. And the cues for all those things you're describing seem to be embodied within that, which tells me for some reason, it's religion wears a lot of hats. And the further you get in history with that group of people, in their history of coping with the environment, it's almost always as if there is a religious record of either giving instruction on how to deal with that, or the way, or the quote correct way that should be observed. I think that's why I found it pretty interesting and maybe useful for me to examine, I'm going to call it the Abrahamic line of looking at those things, because I think it has a flavor. There's definitely an Abrahamic accent to those particular worldviews you're describing, and it shows up in the psychology versus other systems like what I'm more familiar with the various, I won't call them sects, but expressions of Buddhism, and especially getting into the Tao, the idea of what originates Taoism and its orientation of what's right. The other day, I talked about this concept, Tenma, the heavenly demon, and it manifested as a result of the very oppression you're describing right now, the oppression from the law of heaven and the oppression from the law of man. And the answer to that is self-mastery to a point where you transcend that law and by your own volition acquire a measure of mastery that exceeds their jurisdiction. And in defying heaven, you get named as a demon, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're evil. But depending on the way you hear this story and concept articulated, that becomes the definition of someone who is evil. And it gets interesting when you see the way other cultures have navigated these kind of principles.
Well, it's interesting when you look at other cultures and their definitions of what a demon or a daemon is, because there's a lot of ancient cultures didn't necessarily have that stark line between good and evil, because each of the deities had both principles. So, if you were on the good side of whatever deity it is, then, they might do for you, but you tick them off and they're going to smush you. So,
right.
It was, those relationships were a lot more complex. And when you had we were talking about talismans earlier, but when you had the talisman of that god, you yourself could embody both of those things, the good, the bad, the gray. Mm-hmm. Everybody had that within you. And I think when we, I just want to put out there that as we have moved towards transpersonal psychology, we've gotten away from that, having the same therapist for 20 years kind of thing and become more solution focused. But we're also making this move, as slow as it is, to seeing the subconscious as the authentic person and not the demon who lives inside, not the devil on your shoulder, but the subconscious, that one who can only experience the world through what the ego experiences, is actually the authentic you. And the more that you can behave and embody and act in a way that is in line with your subconscious, then what we find is the calmer people are, the less anxiety, less neuroses, less depression. Even when they, study resonant frequencies of people, the highest form of frequency is not love. It's being authentic, being authentically you. And so I think as we're moving towards transpersonal psychology, we're seeing this, being authentic and true to self, which is really, really bad for the powers that be. They really don't want that. They prefer people to be dogmatic and follow the rules.
Well, it leads you to be in a position or a process of decommodification. Yeah. That's fundamentally what it is. I think people offer it a shorthand of decolonization, but I think the issue is commodification, because this happens no matter where you go. And after a certain point, it's passed on culturally. It's the process of self-objectification for the sake of becoming a product that's essentially for sale. Mm-hmm. And this idea of empowerment has been distorted into this idea of being able to place yourself up for the highest bid, rather than having a matter of self-agency and autonomy where you learn the way of overcoming the self, not so that you become some sort of lesser than or greater than, but you can further realize, to the point you were making earlier, the true aspect of what you are within. That's the whole concept of why the kanji for spirit or heart mind, there's no word in English for it. It's translated as heart mind. The word is kokoro. It takes the kanji for heart and spirit and superimposes it. And it represents that inner essence of what you are. And the mind is addressed separately because it's seen as something that is of the world, that is supposed to be of assistance to you. But to a point, in many ways, it gets in the way of the natural order of things. This is why you've got this emphasis in Budo, or the martial sciences, of mind state. So you speak of Shoshin, the beginner's mind, and that's getting a lot more popular now, because the idea behind it is that when your mind is free of preconceptual ideology, it's in a better state to be receptive of new things. And we find that there is a neurological pattern in sciences like flow state that are beginning to emerge, that through repetitious action, through acceptance of the things around you, by controlling those autonomic impulses, you can begin to reach the next phase of no mind, or mushin. And that has been covered by this concept of flow state. But people have been doing this from the beginning. And this is an aspect of transpersonalism that gets out of one's own way. And I find it very useful when you've got other I guess I should say other cultural forms of articulation to approach these things, because there's always this talk of mind equal bad. And it's not that the mind is bad per se. It's just that it has a job to do. It's supposed to act as this filter to take all of this infinite possibility and prioritize what's important. So if your barometer, if the reading on your meter, if what your filter is calibrated to absorb is set to things that have already got these settings that have been handed off to you by people who don't know who you are, you're just being that cookie cutter automaton again. And I think that it becomes something that works against you if you're not aware of that.
Yeah, I think it definitely can. As you were talking, I was thinking about, when neuroscience became popular and they started telling people that the mind is in the brain, that the mind, and that they were almost interchangeable. Mind is in your brain. And up until that time, most all cultures said the mind was in the gut. And there's still people to this day that say the mind is in the gut. And, that's where neurotransmitters come from, is our gut, which is the chemical of the brain.
Yep.
And the brain is the CPU. That's all. It's the tower. It's just the computing aspect of what's going on. It is not your mind. And so I think that was step one in really getting people removed from their own intuition, their own, that's where the term gut feeling comes from, by the way. Mm-hmm. Own empathy, their own understanding of their own body, because they think their mind starts in the computer instead of it starting in the center, in the sacrum, in the sacred space, where we're in the center of all. We're by the heart. The heart also creates neurotransmitters that sends to the brain, right? It's
even after it dies.
Yes. And it's just the CPU. That's all it is. It's just the processing unit the self that you are has a lot more to do with whatever it is you believe animates you. And the reason I say it that way is because I wholeheartedly believe, and nobody can talk me out of this, ever you think about yourself, about how the world works, about God, religion, deities, politics, whatever it is you think, then that is what's true. And people call that confirmation bias or different things like that. But if that is how you see the world, then it is absolutely true for you. And so whatever you think about yourself, that's true.
And I'm going to go out on a limb and I'm going to say, not only do I believe that, I believe that human beings can be, I'm going to say, charted on a wave function, and that whole system of belief in and of itself can be a wave function that is projected into the general idea of the way people act. And these things can become emergent, very similar to how when you're really zoomed in on an image, depending on the resolution, as you zoom out, it comes into focus. And it becomes very interesting when you look at the role of culture in a lot of these things and some of the terms that have been described for that, and a lot of the methodology that's been put in place in the commercial sectors to exploit that mechanism, largely marketing. But I think it ties to a point you were mentioning earlier that there was a point I was going to bring up. When it comes to astrology, for example, when you mention the idea of the subconscious being the origin of the true self, it's a reason why I place less stake on, when it comes to astrology, rising signs or ascending signs. I put less emphasis on that if I'm curious about something, and I look more to that moon sign. And I find it useful with regards to that because of the very points that you were describing earlier. When I observe something, I'm more concerned with the energy that animates it, because if I understand that, I can understand how it fractally expresses itself throughout the collective behavior of that individual potentially. So two people can do the same thing, but if they're animated by different motivations, the context of that action and the way I'll respond to it is night and day. And I think that that's part of the control thing, because if you can get everybody motivated by the same thing, their behavior becomes a metric that can be measured and predictable and eventually encouraged and manufactured. That's the direction I think that algorithms and algorithmic power are already headed towards.
Something that you made me think of, but generally when I think about astrology, I think about sun signs as being more of the ego. Well, you know me, I'm going to apply it to psychology. And
it's all good.
The signs being your shadow self. And so while both the sun and the moon are animating the behavior, it's usually more important to understand the moon, the secrets behind the behavior. But something I was going to say was, there's a reason why people say confidence is sexy. Going on what you're saying, because they, it's easily measured. Our bioelectromagnetic fields are easily measured. People measure them all the time. One of the ways that people get measured a lot is EEGs for their heart. And that it's the bioelectromagnetic field of the heart is what's being measured. It's not the sound of the thump, thump, thump. It's the electromagnetic energy of the heart that's being measured. But we put off a field. And, this is proven in science, but, they used to call it an aura, and people say it was woo-woo and whatever. We also put off thermal radiation, right? This is how night goggles used to work and stuff, as our thermal signatures. And the thing is, and there are measurements and studies about this, study after study after study, that our bioelectromagnetic field changes with our thoughts and with our emotions. And so because we are receivers and transducers and amplifiers at a bioelectromagnetic state, when we are in close enough proximity to hit or be affected by somebody else's electromagnetic state, then that tells us something at a mind level, almost as at an empath level, about that person. So if the person you're talking to, maybe it's a pretty girl, okay, and she's pretty, you know, she's not the most beautiful thing on the planet, but she's pretty, she's cute, you know, but in her mind, she's already thinking, oh, I'm not good enough for this guy. This guy's going to hurt me. He's going to cheat on me. I'm ugly. I'm fat. I'm stupid. She's giving off that energy. And so then there's something about her. You're just like, nah. Right. But then you might have a little chubbier of a girl or a not as cute of a girl, but her personality is amazing. And she has tons of confidence, and, you know, she's funny, and she's got a good sense of humor. You know, she's kind of go with the flow. You want to be around her more because the energy that she gives off based on what she thinks about herself.
In martial arts, there's a few things I want to say about this. So for every psychological principle you bring up, I instantly can find a aspect in my training that this was covered in, which is speaking to the earlier point about how a lot of aspects of Western culture, at least around this topic, you know, they're finally catching up to what people in the old world have known for a long time now.
Oh, for sure.
When you spoke about the mind having a presence within the gut, there are two disciplines I'm reminded of. Firstly, this idea in cultivation known as the Danten. And the Danten is understood as the center, or that sacral point you're describing. It's the seat of a cultivator's power. All of what correlates to that particular practitioner, who they are, their motivations, even potentially the path of their cultivation. All of that is centered there, and it becomes a kind of spiritual fingerprint. It's a kind of identity. It has a frequency, modulation, and essence of its own, to the point where you can even not only recognize people from a distance, but there's gradients to it. And often, generally speaking, understanding the strength of an individual, because you were talking about confidence and presence projection, which is how this is understood. You can get a sense for the overall strength of an individual by the level of energy that's present in a qualitative sense of that individual's Dantian. We understood that in Budo, this idea of harage, and that's a shortening for two kanji, hara and ki. Hara to mean the center, about 2 inches below the navel. It is the gravitational center of the body. And it's the origin of one's grounding energy and the source of their ki, which is the Japanese articulation of this concept of chi, or vital energy. When you have individuals that have cultivated that sense of harage, and it radiates from a sense of competence, you can then begin to sense the presence of other people. You can sense the non-verbal movements, cues, emotional intentions behind them. It leads to this idea of, once you've reached a certain level of strength, the idea is to control that. It's where you get this idea of hidden masters or hidden dragons, where people have reached such a stage of competence that they can subconsciously lower their subconscious energy that they project to come off as less assuming. You know, there's a whole language that's tied to this whole concept. People who've watched anime, if you watch Bleach, that's that whole idea of reiatsu, or spiritual pressure. If you look at Dragon Ball Z, it's the whole concept of power levels and people's ability to suppress these forms. It becomes almost this act of how much can you acquire a measure of strength and get these things done without actually employing your full potential. What that speaks to is an entire faculty of senses and perceptions that as of the introduction of the Industrial Revolution, so many of these things are atrophying, but it doesn't mean that they go away.
One of the things that I recently talked about was people who have synesthetic qualities.
Mm.
You know, these, and I was talking about auras. About being able to, you know, there are people who can perceive auras, and, you know, that's something that, you know, someone might use the word, you know, that ability is atrophied. But the thing is, we just don't know that we can see it. So, for instance, a vast majority of the population, more than 80%, cannot visualize in their mind's eye. So, you know, if I say, think of an apple, they might think of the word apple, or like even a picture of an apple on a piece of paper, or it's just nothing. They often have inner dialogue of talking to themselves inside.
I just saw an article on that. Yeah, go ahead.
So and it's interesting because most of the people I surround myself with, they always go, "What?" And my imagination is it goes too far most of the time. When I think of an apple, like I'm literally imagining somebody picking it off the vine, and there's a dewdrop, and I can smell the apple and taste the apple, and I can see the guy, and his name is Jose, and you know what I mean? Like there's a ladder, and it's an orchard. Like my imagination goes nuts. But you know, 70 to 80%. Actually, I think it's like 77%. Sorry, I want to be as clear as possible. Do not have that inner mind's eye. Now, if you have an inner mind's eye and you are an empathetic person, meaning that you can experience the inner state of another person. So be that if they're telling you something, and so then you're feeling what they are feeling. That's one way to be empathetic. But to be an empath is somebody who can just walk in a room and look at somebody and be like, what's wrong? They haven't said a word. They didn't do anything. You don't know. Or you could walk into a room and be like, who was just arguing? That what's going on? The energy in here is terrible. That is being an empath. And what they say about that is that you can perceive micro cues. So without even knowing it, you can tell if somebody's heart is beating faster. You don't know that you're doing it, but you can almost see it in their neck, the way they're breathing. You know, you pick up all of these micro cues, and that's what makes you an empath. And so if you can pick up micro cues and you can extrapolate multi-sensory experience from one sensory cue, like if I say apple, but then you can taste it, touch it, feel it, smell it, then those abilities are there. You just don't know that you can.
Right.
So we can only see what we believe that we can see. So if we don't believe that we can see something, then we're not going to see it, because all your eyes are doing is picking up frequency waves. Seeing is not what we think it is. All it is a receiver for frequencies.
And that's actually an excellent way to articulate the point I was making about axiomatic anchoring. And the evolutionary response to the phenomenon you're talking about, and why I said it the way I did, is because it's not perceived that those particular abilities are prerequisite for survival. And I will juxtapose that very same mechanism you talked about to what we learned in our training. In order to receive your first Dan or your black belt in my Dyuha that I trained in, you had to pass something that was called the sword test. And what would happen is there's this concept going back to Harage. And while you're training, you learn to develop a kind of sense for when you're going to be struck. And it happens partially through an emergent behavior of repetition. You end up feeling before it occurs. And then eventually you get so good at it, you can project phantom strikes on your opponent. In other words, you can create the feeling that you're going to strike, but then you go somewhere else. You can hide the intention of your presence or of whatever you're doing and create these mix-ups in the midst of fighting. But that's supposed to be cultivated over all of this time, to the point where if you've maintain an understanding of your fundamental taijutsu, or your body striking method, the fighting technique we're describing here, you can begin to intercept fighting intent of the opponent. That is known as saki, or killing intent. The idea in Budo, in higher forms of fighting, especially with regards to that, is to learn how to channel intention to a razor edge, but not project or leak any of that intention out, because people can subconsciously pick up on it, especially those who have trained. So the idea is that for an individual who is prepared to begin the advanced levels of training, you have to demonstrate that you've gained the ability to intercept hostile intention. So you're blindfolded and you sit in the position known as seiza, which is an uncomfortable position where you're essentially sitting on the back of your ankles and your knees are on the ground, hands are in your lap. The blade is raised above your head and the instructor projects the intention of striking, and then they strike down at your head. If you've got a solid sense of harage, you can sense that saki, and you naturally will move out of the way without you meaning to. It'll happen in an instant on its own.
Well, this is the same reason why, like, you could be in a room and you whip around because you know somebody's looking at you. It's that same sensory ability. The micro cues are so microscopic. But, you know, and there's another concept that goes with it that I know is found in Eastern teachings. And that's, you know, you cannot be an empath without trauma. So
you are going right where I was about to next.
Yeah. Yep. So the only way to develop those skills is out of that necessity. So you were talking about survival instinct, right? So that has to be turned on. So the more affluent, the more entitled, the more protected a person is, then the less empathetic that they will be. They'll never develop, you know, empath tendencies until they actually have some trauma. We all have to have a struggle. We all have to learn things the hard way sometimes. That is how the world works, and that is how we develop our gifts. And, you know, far be it from me to ever speak about Kung Fu or anything like that. But I did have somebody tell me one time about that this one form of Kung Fu that you create all these micro fractures.
You're talking about a process known as Qigong, and it is known as bone and marrow conditioning.
Yeah.
But yeah, go ahead.
So, you know, and it makes the bone stronger, you know, but that it's very painful, I would assume, to create all these tiny fractures to make the bone stronger so that you don't feel the pain later. Empathy is the exact same thing. We become highly attuned to our environment so that we don't experience that same trauma that got us before.
Exactly. And it's interesting because there's phases to that. So I'll make a slight shift because there's a interesting community that talks a lot about this. And they're the same people that would list an ex-boyfriend as being narcissistic because she disagreed with him with something. It's that whole idea of people, and I think that there's a lot of truth to their articulation of the empathic experience, where if they aren't given mechanisms to address a lot of that, I think some people, they show up with such a high potential for emotional experience and attunement that they run into the problem where they struggle with recognizing the difference between one another, themselves and other people. And this may echo some of your practice that you have to deal with when you're treating some people or have treated people in the past. They inherit the emotional mantle or the energy that animates the room, and they feel things and they don't know why.
Right.
And part of the issue ends up being them lacking a strong sense of self-understanding and recognition, especially if their initial wounds are rooted in not accepting the self. And I think a hallmark, and this is me speaking from a position of ignorance. Again, I don't have any formal training in this, but I understand trauma in a way that creates what I articulate as self-decoherence. In other words, the more trauma you experience, unless you make deliberate action or have an autonomic response to the contrary, you de-associate with the self. And so the coping mechanism becomes ways of allowing for you to distance yourself from yourself. And it's a weird way of articulating it. But what tends to happen is when you have a greater understanding of the self and you go back and you face what you had to address there, you can develop the proper tools you need to learn how to create strong enough barriers so that you're not influenced by all of these micro instances that are the experiences and emotions of other people. And that's in the absence of people projecting onto you, just ambiently picking these things up. So there used to be cultural articulation of these things. It was what I guess I could call intellectual hygiene, to give people understanding and opportunities to clear the room of a lot of these things, ways of confronting the self so that they can distinguish from self and others. But I think that's part of what ends up getting lost in the bigger picture of these things, especially with getting to an earlier point you made. These concepts get seen and framed as religious evil.
Mm. Well, I mean, and Sick Diggy is doing a great job putting the terms in the chat. Something I wanted to talk about to what you were saying is depersonalization.
Mm.
What happens is somebody may go through a trauma and then they don't resolve the trauma. And I'm one of those people who are like, they traumatized me, and trauma is not always bad. Trauma is a struggle.
Right.
A tornado could go through your neighborhood. That's trauma. You know, it's not always somebody did something to you, but it creates a struggle. It creates a hurdle. And the only way to build confidence is to get from one side of the hurdle to the other. And that confidence and that self-resilience is what brings you closer to yourself. So like if I walk in a room and I am not my authentic self and I have not resolved my traumas, but those antennas are on high and there's something going on in the room that makes me feel anxious or uncomfortable, I'm immediately going to get scared because the last time I felt anxious and uncomfortable, something bad happened. If my confidence and my self-resilience is high, I may get anxious at first. And me personally, I get social anxiety with huge crowds of people, well, not even huge, with crowds of people, especially if I don't know them. If I know them, it's not a problem because I already know your vibe. I already know your energy. I know who you are, and it's fine. But crowds of strangers, you know, and a lot of that is being on high alert. And so I'm picking up their nervousness, their, being unsure, their, but I also know at the end of the day, I'm going to be okay because I have self-resilience. I have resolve. I trust myself and I can get out of situations, many situations. I'm kind of a small person. So, not physical situations, most situations I can, maybe talk myself out of or whatever. But so the difficulty is the unresolved trauma. When you compartmentalize your trauma or you shove it way down and you're not resolving it, then it will have the tendency to guide you and have you to do things that you wouldn't naturally, normally, or even want to do. And that creates something called depersonalization, almost where you see and hear yourself doing stuff like you've been depersonalized. You've come out of yourself, and it's almost like you can't stop yourself from, you've lost your temper and you're saying things, you're yelling things, you're throwing things, you're crying uncontrollably, you're doing these things because you're so disconnected from yourself in those moments. And Jung had a great saying about that, because he was like, you continue to ignore your shadow, and it's going to dictate your whole life, and you will call it fate.
Right. Yeah. That's a good way of really, that's actually a whole field in and of itself, because that's one way that expresses. And then there's the fractal issues that causes too, because then that particular impetus for disassociation becomes a coping mechanism.
Yeah.
And so everything in your life gets reframed and reoriented towards that. And I think that's one response. I think people can take that same experience and then end up projecting as a preemptive action to avoid being hurt as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'll break up with you before you break up with me. I'll start a fight with you.
Mm-hmm.
Start a fight with me. And that's also, there's some of that is comfort too. Like, I know how to resolve our situation, and that's by getting in a fist fight with you, because that's what I'm very used to. That's what I'm comfortable with. And I'm not speaking for myself, I'm just in general. Then I will punch you in the face so that we can go ahead and get this fist fight over with, and then we're resolved and we move on.
Yeah. And that's where you hear this meme about, I like toxic. And you're like, nah, you just traumatized and you ain't fixed it yet.
Right. Right. You are replaying your trauma over and over and over and over. And we do that. Unresolved trauma will continue to play out over and over and over. This is why no matter what, you're always picking the same woman, you're picking the same dude. This happens at your job all the time. Everybody's always against you. This always breaks down. When you're saying those kind of things, it's because there's something unresolved, and you keep playing out the trauma over and over again.
That's a big, again, I had to preface, I'm not a therapist, but when I look at situations like that in particular, it's kind of like what happens when you're trying to work on a technique. And if you didn't work on what we understand as the fundamentals, it's called kihon in general, your fundamental aspects, like your stances, why your foot is angled a certain type of way, why your breathing is a certain type of way, you're okay at first. But the more you do it, the more foundational problems begin to really resolve themselves and express themselves and keep you from getting at levels you potentially could. So if you've got a habit, for example, of putting too much weight on your front foot for a particular stance, and you need to have more on your back foot, you either learn by getting put on your behind, or you learn because you just can't generate enough power. And even if you do it for years and years and years and years and years, it's when you're put into a position to where you have to fix it that oftentimes you will. If you don't put yourself in a position to need to change it, you tend not to. And I think that's where the challenge comes, and where people make all of these miraculous leaps and bounds in correcting it. Because I think what I find interesting is how quickly you can address these things once you're put into a position to where you have to confront it. And once you do, and you do so from a position of honest, resolute acceptance, then you can overcome the anxiety affiliated with it, getting back to that principle of death we were talking about. And this is such a recurring theme in martial arts, and that tells me that that was a prerequisite in order for people to face these ridiculous situations in war. The battlefield doesn't care about your trauma. The technique doesn't care if you have poor kihon. Train and get it right the first time. There's an axiom. You cry in the dojo so that you can laugh on the battlefield. And it's not some sort of sociopathic muhaha like death. It's you die first so that you can live to the fullest. That's that resolute acceptance. if you face what that obstacle was head on, what else is left then? And it leads you to these axioms like there's nothing to fear but fear itself, like, but that's a real thing.
Well, you're kind of answering what Compassionate was saying. I had a little more to add to that, if it's okay.
Oh, no, go ahead. That's why I got it up there.
Okay. He and Sick Diggy had questions. And then
let me know which one you want me to highlight from Sick once you answer Callous and Compassionate.
Okay. So what resolution looks like, when you go to resolve your traumas, the easiest example for me to give people is childhood trauma, but it can be adult relationships or, being in the military. It can be all kinds of things that can give you trauma. But the easiest example is like a childhood trauma. So one of the difficulties with resolving childhood trauma is that as you're remembering that trauma, it may not seem traumatic to your adult self, or it may seem silly, or that it was bad. Mom beat me senseless with an electrical cord and I was covered in welts, right? But what our adult brain also does is we're like, but, mom was a single mom and she was under a lot of stress and she was having to work 2 jobs. And I know that was during a period of time that this was happening. Like we immediately act dismissive of whatever it was that happened because we're putting our now mind on the thing that happened then. So if we go with that example of, being beat with an electrical cord, okay, and you're covered in welts, and let's say you're 8 years old. 8-year-old you does not have an adult mind. 8-year-old you cannot do the things that you are doing now to be dismissive of your trauma. And so what you have to do to be able to resolve that trauma is to put yourself back in the place of that 8-year-old whose mother, the person who is supposed to love you, who probably does love you, which makes it even more confusing, did something horrible, terrible, awful to you. And then you feel unloved and you feel worthless and you feel unimportant and you feel used and all of it on top of physical pain. And you have to go back and keep putting yourself in that place and get to the point where you can remember it and you keep talking about it and you tell people about it, the people you trust, or a therapist or somebody, you tell people about it, you talk about it, you think it, you talk about it, you think it, until the feelings that come with it are less. Are manageable and controllable. But if you try to stop yourself from crying or being upset or being mad or all these things when you remember it, you're never going to resolve it, because it's almost like that 8-year-old is frozen in time in that moment, because that 8-year-old was never able to express what they were feeling in that moment. And so everything is stuck. So resolution comes from acknowledging those feelings, thinking about those feelings. When we have trauma, it's interesting because the memory of trauma is not stored in the neocortex where every other memory is stored. It's actually stored in the limbic system.
Mm-hmm.
I'm segueing into Sick Diggy's question, which is the one. Oh yeah, you got it up.
Yep.
It's trauma is stored in the limbic system, and the limbic system is your autonomic nervous system. It's where everything automatic happens. Your blood pressure, your respirations, your heart rate, your digestion. That's where everything happens. So trauma is stored there. So this is why if we have a significant enough trauma over a period of time, or we have a big enough one-time trauma, it can lead to PTSD. So what happens there is that trauma memory has no connection to our neocortex, or very, very little. This is why you'll have people like, I don't remember much of my childhood. I don't remember a lot of what happened when I was deployed, because there's not a lot, or if any, connection to the neocortex. And so then we get, somebody else said it, trauma triggers, Teggingtron. trauma triggers. This is where you get trauma triggers, which are things like hearing a word, hearing a statement, smelling a smell, seeing a thing, being in the same neighborhood, somebody bringing up Afghanistan, somebody saying the name of your ex, somebody saying the name of your mom, somebody talking about when you lived in the old neighborhood and you know what happened there. And it will trigger those limbic responses without your neocortex being able to control those responses. And so your heart rate will change, your digestion will change, your breathing will change. You'll have all of these reactions, which may lead to a panic attack or not. You may actually start seeing things and experiencing things, because the limbic system is also where dream states come from, when you have that trauma trigger. So the way to resolve those always has to start with bringing that memory from the limbic system into the neocortex to then replay that memory and start peeling off those layers of feelings so that you won't be triggered later by those things. You have resolved that situation.
It's so interesting because and I brought the next one up from Shade Tree Therapy because it's an excellent lead into what was being said. My particular branch of training was unique because it went in an opposite direction that most other ryuha or styles of ninjutsu would go. Typically speaking, when you get into a lot of the older ryuha, their whole thing is, okay, here's the weapons, here's our fighting technique, here's how you hide, here's how you break in stuff, here's your tools. Like, you get all of that out the gate. Instead, what they did with us is the very first thing we learned was a system of power known as Kuji-in and Kuji-kiri. And it connects it to everything that's in this comment right here. So when you were making mention that there's certain aspects of involuntary action, especially when it comes to memory and that's connected to emotion and feeling, where most of that is stored limbically in our emotional centers. That was important because the limbic system has more seniority than the prefrontal cortex.
It'll override everything.
Every single time. And the only thing that has more seniority than that is your autonomic system. So what we do is there's a form of integration. That's what these exercises are doing. So with the mantra, we're forming the particular symbol with our hands. Then we enter in a particular state of mind through meditation and altering the blood oxygen context, depending on what the particular energy we're attempting to emulate. So to raise energy, you deprive the body of oxygen. To decrease energy, you oversaturate. It sounds so contradictory, but to slow things down, you hypersaturate the blood, or I guess you oxygenate. I guess that's or alkalinize. And then if you want to raise energy, you make it more acidic. I don't know why it works like that, but it just does. And
can I interject for 1 second?
Oh yeah, sure.
1 second. It's because an increase in oxygen has a sedative effect on the human body.
All right, it'll slow down the autonomic system. Yeah. Forgot about that. Yes, that's why.
Okay. Go ahead.
Right. Yeah. So you can see the consistency here. So whenever we were cultivating a particular aspect of it where we needed to slow things down, we took in more oxygen. But if we needed to sharply increase our energy in an instant, we deprived our system of oxygen to create and emulate that mind state. And what happens is you learn to create what was later described as psychological triggers by imagining the kanji that particular technique represents, having a somatic component in the form of the mudra, where your fingers interlock to form and weave that particular symbol that it represents. There's a phonetic component. There's a whole mantra tied to each particular energy. What was that? Yeah. Umbashira Montaya Sawaka is the first one for Rin, which stands for power. And it's one of the first techniques you learn in Kuji-kiri. There's a sequence of writing the kanji in the air. It is a whole entire process that involves everything that was said by shade therapy there. And what it did was, when you're in a position of great stress, you don't have time to do what I guess other people may try and do, and take time and go through this long process of controlling your breathing or the box breathing techniques and all of that. What you could do was invoke that particular hand symbol and even say the word, and instantly your mind will remember that state of altered consciousness you conditioned yourself for. And you can immediately make use of that energy. From the outside looking in, it looked like you just did a magic technique. But in the general sense, you are taking advantage of the very principle you were just describing that can cause trauma. It also, from that same vector, can be intentionally used to empower yourself.
Oh, absolutely. That's like with the military using Fibonacci sequences. About that.
I know there's a lot of ways they can do that, as far as using the golden mean to create altered states of mind and get people in the flow state, etc.
So one of the things that they use the Fibonacci sequences for is it's certain codes of numbers, and those codes of numbers do specific things. It could be take a headache away. It could be make your legs stronger. There's just tons of code. There's books of codes, and these soldiers would memorize these codes. They would, there's a lot of training that goes into it. And then when they needed to use the code, they would speak the code to the body part, for whatever it was for. And so, like, if I need my legs to be stronger, I would speak the code into my thighs, and then my legs would be stronger. Or if I need to get rid of a headache, I would touch my forehead and speak the Fibonacci code. And that's very similar. And, I know people say the terms placebo effect, and it kind of gets dismissive, but what a placebo effect is that your mind believes it without any chemical interference. So your mind is doing the thing. So if you believe, we've kind of circled back, but if you believe that you can get rid of a headache, or you can make your legs stronger, or you can jump over that barrier, all the way believe it without question, then you can. You obviously can. And so that's how, and the military did a whole lot with Fibonacci sequence. Of course, that was back in, Project Stargate and MK Ultra and all those woo-woo things. They did a lot with the Fibonacci sequences.
They did a lot with that synthetic sense you were talking about.
Yeah,
people could. Oh my God! Like the type of crazy stuff they ended up doing for the sake of espionage will blow you away. Maybe that'll be another conversation we do, because that'd be a cool topic, because a lot of that's declassified now. And I think it's probably good for people to know, because I don't know why they wouldn't begin to explore that with the advent of things like Neuralink starting to come online. They will absolutely be making use of a lot of these things, so you can feel colors and stuff like that. Like yeah.
We should go all the way over the Gateway Project, because it talks about the Fibonacci sequences. It talks even about breath work, that you can do instant ascension through a specific breath. Oh boy, but it makes you dizzy. I did it. You do this, you're laying flat and you're doing this heavy breathing where you're taking in breaths, and then you're just like letting and it's diaphragmatic breaths, and then just letting your diaphragm just thump back into your back. And you do that multiple times, and then you blow out all the breath, and you do a quick sit up to stand, and don't take another breath. And it's wild.
Here's how you pass out and get into altered states. I think they want to get people into a theta wave state. And I know when they got into what they were doing, creating techniques that they could remote view and get into the astral plane and all of that. Well, I'm going to put a bookmark on that. Yeah. And we'll dedicate a show to that, because that'd be some cool stuff to go over, because there's a lot of receipts coming out of science now to validate that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. the remote viewing stuff that was just, men who stare at goats kind of thing.
Allegedly.
They're finding, the bilocation and there's a lot of things in the quantum field that you could get on a astral plane or a quantum grid and experience things bilocally where you are and wherever that is.
Yeah, and there's some technologies that are coming out now that are looking for very creative ways of making use for that, with a lot of ambitious projects going to places outside of Earth, we'll just say.
Yeah, I just watched one where a guy went to Mars.
Oh my goodness, people remote viewing and freaking doing mining work from a distance. That'll be crazy.
Oh, that's wild.
Yeah. But okay, well, I mean, we're at the hour mark. We did start a little late, so I don't want to keep you too late this time. Do we have any more questions in the chat?
Usually when I get to talking, I forget to look.
Nah, I usually had my computer sitting here, but I had to sit here and squint.
Oh, yeah. I will say that Onk figured out the one I was talking about. It was Muay Thai.
Oh, Muay Thai. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Muay Thai. I've been... I'm going to hold that conversation later. I've been busy. That's what I'm going to say. And I've got a lot of interesting techniques that are in alignment with what you were describing with Qigong, but in different ways that sort of tied to that. I've got this whole concept of urban asceticism that I'm really looking to brand and get out there. And when I say brand, I don't mean commercialize or, make any profit off of, just to really share these ideas, bring back a lot of these concepts and get away from the commodification actually, and do it in a way that's pretty holistic for people who are interested, because I think this term monk is overstated. I don't think it's accurate for the way a lot of people would practice here. And I don't want to necessarily call it minimalism. It's more of a practical downgrading of depending on commercialization for fulfillment. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. It's all, and we've talked about that before, your worth being externalized. So everything is commodified, right? So, and religiosity does this, psychology does this, industrialization does this. We're at a place where you're not even allowed to say good things about yourself, or you're bragging.
Right.
You're not allowed to even speak facts about yourself, because your worth is dictated by someone else. So if I want to know about you and what your worth is, I'm going to ask the people you know, instead of having a conversation with you. And then I'm going to ask the people I know to rate and value and judge you, to tell me if I should be your friend. Everything is externalized.
And when you start opening up the floodgates of how that's kind of happening in a fractalized sense across social media, where I guess it's getting into the Dunbar effect, where people are vicariously living these relationships through other people. What's the term they have? Parasocially? Yeah, parasocially. Experiencing all through that at max capacity by scrolling through and really basing their real life compass on that. And getting back to what we were talking about, I'm going to call it autonomic memory. Mm-hmm. I think they had a term where they said the body always remembers, or the body keeps score.
The body keeps the score.
Yeah. Yep. That's where I'm at with it.
Great point, by the way.
Right. If you just really let the gravity behind that sink in, man, there's some people who are coming across inputs of data that are exceeding capacity by thousands of instances, sometimes millions, depending on the nature of your work. And people are adapting to that. And you just got to eat that Vegas pressure. it's got to be addressing your stress hormone, your cortisol levels. You are going to be eating at least 80% of that. I think they said that when you imagine an action in your mind, the overwhelming majority of biochemical energy required to do it is already done, even if you physically don't enact on it. So if I imagine a punch, it can be an effective form of training because I'm training that neurological pathway that completes that circuit to do the punch.
Oh, for sure. And so in something that I do with people who have childhood trauma, or people who were physically abused in relationships, there's something that can happen is that we can ruminate over those memories, which is essentially the mind telling you process this shit. Excuse my language, but
no, you're fine.
Why it keeps popping up over and over, and that's why you think about it and ruminate it and roll on it, and then you can't sleep at night, blah blah blah. But what I'll do with people, because whatever you imagine in your mind's eye becomes, your body does not know the difference, because your subconscious does not know the difference, because your subconscious never lives in the external world. It only lives in your mind. So whatever you're experiencing, then whatever you think of it, whatever you're processing in the moment, that's how your subconscious can see it. So whatever you do in your mind's eye becomes reality to your mind. So what I'll do with people, because a lot of times if you're a child and you're being abused, or, you're in an abusive relationship, there's something that's keeping you from being able to defend yourself. And I'll work with people on, when we get to a particular point in the process, then we get to this time where we can reframe the memory. And so what we'll do, depending on the person, we may have the memory and you're there as your 8-year-old self, but also you as your 35-year-old self shows up.
Gets the mentor. Yep.
Yeah. So what if you showed up today on scene, what would you do? And you imagine it. And people say all kinds of things. I might shoot this person, stab this person, everything is fine, because this is about defense, or we can give 8-year-old you superpowers. So this particular thing is happening to you. Boom, you have superpowers. What do you do? And so we reframe the memory that you are no longer powerless, and we can increase your resiliency and your confidence. And then we talk about, if you're ever in that kind of situation again, what are you going to do? So it's kind of like what you were talking about, where we're training the response so that we don't get to that freeze response where I've been traumatized by something and then I'm triggered and now I can't move, I can't talk, I can't think. We train, we're going to respond like this. Every time somebody makes you feel like this is your response. Every time something like this happens, this is your response. This is what you're going to do. If you see an adult doing the same thing to an 8-year-old out in public or at a family reunion or at your aunt's house, this is what you're going to do. This is what you're going to say and what you're going to do. And that increases that confidence and that resilience as well.
I concur. And we're all talking about the same pathways. Yeah. And I think the important part about that is to show the power of agency, and I don't want to turn it into a blame the victim sort of scenario. This is more along the lines of there's hope there, because if you can be harmed by it, mutually, you can also be healed by that same vector.
Well, it becomes your responsibility. So I tell people a lot that regardless of whatever happened to you, especially if you had no agency in it, children don't have agency in things that happen to them.
Right.
Something happens to you. The unfortunate thing is it is not your fault that thing happened, but it's now your responsibility to deal with it. And that's just how the world works.
Yeah. And if you understand that you've got a way to respond, which I think puts people into despair when they don't know what else to do. That's when the problem starts happening. When they don't believe that they've got the capacity to respond in a way that will result in an efficacious action. When people have that sense of agency taken away, that's when the issues truly begin to manifest that I see, which is why I make emphasis on a lot of these mechanisms to show that the same way you can be harmed, you can also be healed. And a warning for people who haven't experienced those things before, that the way you can be healed, you can also be harmed. And so the key thing is having that mindful, intentional engagement with these things. And a lot of this gets prevented by not only self-awareness but self-acceptance. And from there, we get into the conversation of transcendence. Because once you've anchored away from having these fear-based, anchored, axiomatic relationships with each other, you can then begin to look at ways that enhance that even further. And just like we were talking about before, these things are always there. It's just that our dial was tuned in to survival, but that's not the only thing. The reason why our bodies have a predisposition for survival is because these other things are energy intensive. So when you've developed a surplus of capability and capacity, you've built that resilience you were describing before, your requirements to feel safe aren't as high. And I don't mean in an irresponsible sense. I mean, you're not wasting energy. And I want to make an important parallel here. A sign of mastery in martial arts is being able to take the energy that a beginner would to do a technique and have an output that's 8 and 9 times 10 times greater without needing the same amount of energy to do the same thing. If you're following what I'm trying to say here.
Yeah.
And I think that you can do the same thing with your inner environment, with the way you engage emotionally with yourself and others. There's a kind of ease, acceptance, not an enabling, but a controlled, and not even so much control, but an acceptance for things that's so resolute that you aren't moved by the negativity of others. And it permits you to properly respond with agency as you see fit. And that is a form of inner mastery that is the result of being animated by a higher perception. And that comes with not spending so much of your energy economy just on the lower levels of survival, the way many may find themselves locked in.
Yeah. Well, I think what you were getting at is that acceptance, that acceptance of self is not, it's not, oh my gosh, so many times, and I'm going to curse again, I'm sorry, but so many times I've had men sitting in my therapy suite, well, and women have done this too, but where they'll be like, I don't know, I'm just an asshole.
What?
I'm just an asshole. That is an acceptance of self that is not cool, because when you know thyself, then you know what is you and what is not you. And so then you're gonna have this impetus to change things that are not you. And so it's not like, well,
right, because you don't actually have agency over that.
Right.
Okay.
But
yeah.
I think when as an adult, you start to notice, I have a lot of problems with self-esteem. I always think I'm dirty, or I always think I'm gross, or, I'm just, everything bad always happens to me. I'm just helpless, or nothing's ever going to work out. I'm always hopeless. And then if you can find the root of that, if you can go back to that moment that someone made you feel dirty or worthless or helpless or hopeless, and you can process that, you can see that you were never dirty or worthless or helpless or hopeless, and you aren't going forward. And so you can resolve those feelings that have kind of guided your life up until the moment when you realize somebody gave that to you, and now you can get rid of it. Right.
And that's what I'm talking about. This whole idea of inheriting data from the wave function, and I'm going to say this, this is where you get concepts like what you see emerging from the doll tests that they do when people have all of these negative associations about the self and don't even really, nobody necessarily told them that, but they were inferred from the environment.
Yeah. I mean, they were told in some capacity that you're bad or you're ugly or, you know, anything that looks like you. So you're talking about the doll tests where the black kids would say that the white dolls were more beautiful, smarter.
Well, I'm saying yes. And the key and why those tests were significant is because of the ages.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like they were already in social environments where their prefrontal cortex is still developing and, you know, they've got more of a grounded limbic system going on where, you know, they're exposed to a bunch of stuff. You're largely insulated at 3, 4, 5. You know what I'm saying? So to already be with that level of understanding, it's hinting to something more systematic is what I'm highlighting here.
Yeah, definitely.
They were able to infer that measure of information without anyone actually telling them that. It was inferred from the environment and it was consistent.
You know, one of the things that they had looked at, because you know that the original test was a long time ago. And
Yeah.
one of the things they looked at was that the researcher who gave the kids the dolls was white. And I think it was a white woman, but I'm not 100% sure about that. But the person that gave them the dolls was white. And so there were some thoughts about, were the kids people pleasing?
Right.
By picking the white doll. And so when they recreated the study, that was a black woman that gave the dolls. And the unfortunate thing was the results did not change.
Yeah. And I think what made it was the hypothesis that people were going to affiliate positive characteristics to themselves. That's what was expected.
Right.
What they didn't expect was the black children in every metric to affiliate the negative characteristics with themselves and positive characteristics with white still, which is going to the conditioning there. That's what the wave function is presenting. And why I was saying that there appears to be this kind of, I'm going to do a video on this. I'm going to have to do a video on this where I talk about the wave function. I've been talking about it too much and not explaining it.
Yeah.
I'm going to break it all down. But I highly suspect that human beings naturally defer a great level of inference from this particular established wave function. And it's kind of related to consensus reality, but I also see it emerge in civilizational behavior in the form of different wave functions, like the Elliott wave principle, like the data that you see in charts. It's almost predictable. You know, there's this mappable function of human choice that tends to collapse a particular sort of way every single time. And you'll get individual instances of agency where people collapse that wave function and do something specific, but that particular wave function is what algorithms are targeting when they want to guide people and manufacture behavior. And there's whole markets tied to this. So it's an interesting study. And I think it's right in your wheelhouse too, because the mechanisms, the levers that are being pulled and manipulated are the same ones you're using to help people.
Yeah. Just anecdotally, because I thought of this story and I think it's cute. When my oldest son was 4, you know, and I'm going through school. So I did a lot of tests on my own kid.
You was one of them moms. Yeah, my mom was a psych nurse, so I understand what you're saying.
Like, oh, object permanence. Let's play with that for a little bit. You know,
funny
and stuff. But I did the doll test on my son, and I want to say he was like 3, but he could have been 4. And so I did the doll test, and the first question I asked was, which baby is smarter? And my son is looking at the baby dolls, and then he looks up at me kind of out of the side of his eye, and he goes, Mom, they're dolls.
Oh I was gonna say he probably got cookie points on that one. Like, you messed my experiment up, but you made me proud at the same time.
Right. So I didn't run that experiment on any of the other kids, but that was cute. I should have known that he was, autistic at that point. So
That's funny. Well, that's actually an important point, because I think that has a relationship to the wave function, where there's far more independent action taking place, and there's not this desire to seek the consensus before collapsing the wave. Yeah. I think that is an important point to highlight there, to your point, because a lot of times that behavior or tendencies that indicate to that behavior, there's flags that come up for people to try to see, quote unquote, what's wrong with them. Why aren't they adhering to this wave function?
Right. Because social conformity does not have the value. I mean, there is some value, especially like as teenagers and stuff, because there's social value. You're learning those things at that time. Mm. But justice, equity, and fairness, it takes much higher priority and has much more importance than social conformity, almost to the point where social conformity is stupid.
Detrimental. Yeah.
It's just a ridiculous concept. It's like, well, why would you even do that? Well, because everybody, what? Why? That's so dumb.
But I think we're back to when you start putting people in a position to where their well-being is tied to it. That's when you start seeing the conformity to conformity. Yeah. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, because no matter what, there's dating and mating that has to go on too, right? And so regardless of what your inner thoughts are, maybe as somebody who's autistic, you have to learn the rules and play the game. And everybody else knows when you're dating, you have to learn the rules and play the game, no matter how dumb and ridiculous it is. And so, there is some conformity that has to happen for, if you want to get married, if you want to have babies, if you want to have somebody in your life, you have to conform to some of these social games and rules to be able to, participate. While there may be some woman out there who would love it if you just walk up and be like, my favorite dinosaur is a triceratops, and I'm going to tell you why. There's a woman out there that would absolutely love that, but it's so rare that, how often are you going to run that experiment? So you learn to be like, hey, baby, what's up? You're pretty today. And, can I get your number? And, you play the game.
There's supposed to be an entire part of social development dedicated to that has largely gone missing these days and become very, very convoluted. So I'm definitely with you. And there is a lot of second order problems that are starting to show up now, more so than ever, amongst that being one of many. And the particular demographic you're describing, withholding, they're not even, they may even be better suited. I'm going to say, like, it's funny. And we'll go ahead and start winding down after this. It's kind of funny because there's this meme that's sort of understood at this point of women that are on the spectrum being the secret hard select pick.
How so?
So the idea, and remember what you just said, this one being disconnected from the wave function more so than other people, or at least having decoherence with a lot of the wave function. Number one. Then number two, having behavior that's considered, quote, quirky, that isolates you from the rest of the group even further.
Right.
And then two, if you've got a measure of attractiveness, that solves all the problems a lot of people are saying they're having with normal wave function people, or not hetero, what is the term? Neural normality?
Neurotypicals.
Neurotypical. I was like, where is that term from? Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So, you get kind of like the best of both worlds. Like you're not going to get this convoluted nonsense. You're going to get straight, direct answers. Like you don't have to play the guessing game. And that's an oversimplification, but that's where that comes from. The whole idea that, chicks on the spectrum are the meta. That's the term I was looking for.
I think men would like girls on the spectrum more because there's more analytics that go on. I think, you know, that speaks to why, and I've lost names at this point, but on the cartoon Scooby-Doo, you know, you have the beautiful
Velma.
blonde, and you have, so you have Daphne and you have Velma, right?
Yep.
But more men find Velma attractive than Daphne.
Yep. And it's part of the reason we're saying, you know, especially if she hits the she's got the indicators. So if she's got the indicators and she's on that quirky tip, especially in this environment, it gets you, it's the secret meta pick that, and I'm only saying that because I'm reminded of that. It's pretty amusing. But I think it's kind of a trend that we're seeing sort of happening as a result, that it seems counterintuitive, but I think it speaks to the overall condition of there being so much convolution on how to even engage and express a lot of these things, that people are just tired of the games and they would just rather have things be up front. Like, look, it is what it is. We're going A, B, and C was good. And it's like, okay, I'm cool with that. And there you go, happily ever after.
Yep. It's a lot easier that way, honestly, but you know, that could be my spectrumality coming out.
It's people being people. I'm gonna be real with you.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think I want to jump into this whole idea of not the self-acceptance piece, but states of mind, especially getting into overcoming the self in a way where you're learning to get out of your own way, and mechanisms that can assist with that. Because there's still I think that's a whole rabbit hole of information that is immediately actionable, it's useful, and it's being targeted now. Because I think that acquiring a measure of resilience and agency over the kind of content you consume online, even, and I mean, you know, as you're scrolling and whatnot, your ability to be emotionally moved by some of the things that are presented there. Mm-hmm. I think these are useful coping mechanisms that can get you off of fear-based responses and more into asking the question of, is this information serving me, yes or no?
Mm-hmm. I would love to do that. I have several things that I could share with people they could do at home by themselves. And I'm one of those weird therapists that will say, you don't always need a therapist. You can do a lot of this at home by yourself. So I have no problem teaching people how to do those things.
I think that's a topic. I'm very excited on that, and I look forward to seeing what you can come up with to kind of share with folks and be of service with. And I will do the exact same thing from my perspective. On that note, if we don't have any more questions, I guess we can go ahead and call it. We did almost an hour and 40. We're still on brand for time.
I like it.
Yeah, not bad for starting late. This was a cool one. I appreciate it. Oh no, thank you. Appreciate your time. And it doesn't seem like we've got any more questions, so we'll go ahead and close up then. To the founders of the space, os. For those of you that are in the chat and listening to the playback, os. This has been the Nameless Protagonist and Maggie Thompson under the veil. Appreciate your time, and keep some of these points that we've mentioned in mind. You can look forward to this soon in the very near future. And again, if you have any questions about this, I highly encourage you to say something in the comments section. It not only helps the algorithm, it can help spur some topics in the future. This stuff is for you guys, so feel free to make requests here as you see fit or ask for clarification. I'm always answering. And remember, wari wari no michi. This is the way. Os.